The screen fades in from black to the sterile white lights of a hospital corridor, where urgent footsteps echo against polished floors and monitors beep rhythmically in the background. A woman's trembling voice cuts through the silence, desperate and broken in a way that money can never fix. She had everything the world told her mattered: a corner office on the 30th floor, a mansion in the most exclusive neighborhood, cars that cost more than most people's homes, and a name that made boardrooms fall silent when she entered. He had nothing by the world's standards: worn shoes that he polished every night to maintain his dignity, a modest apartment where the rent was always a struggle, and calloused hands that told the story of a man who knew what it meant to work until exhaustion became his closest companion. But he had something she desperately needed, something her billions couldn't buy, something she never saw coming. In exactly 48 hours, their worlds would collide in the most devastating and beautiful way imaginable, and nothing would ever be the same again. She would come face to face with the man she had publicly humiliated just 3 weeks earlier, the man whose application she had mocked, whose child she had dismissed as an inconvenience, whose very presence in her building she had treated as contamination. And in that moment of recognition, when she realized that her daughter's life depended entirely on the compassion of the man she had treated as less than human, every assumption she ever made about power, worth, and dignity would shatter like expensive crystal hitting marble floors. This is not just a story about a blood donation. This is a story about the moment when pride meets humility, when cruelty meets mercy, when a woman who thought she had conquered the world discovered she knew nothing about what truly matters. This is a story about a single father who had every reason to walk away, to let karma do its work, to remind a cruel woman that actions have consequences, but instead chose something far more powerful. This is the story of how one man's grace became another woman's salvation, and how sometimes the people we look down upon are standing on higher ground than we ever imagined. Welcome to African Tales, where we explore stories that challenge us, change us, and remind us of our shared humanity. Now let me take you to the heart of one of Africa's most dynamic cities, where gleaming skyscrapers cast shadows over crowded marketplaces, where luxury SUVs navigate the same chaotic streets as overcrowded buses, where million-dollar penthouses overlook neighborhoods where families share single rooms and water is a daily struggle. This is a city of stark contrasts where wealth and poverty exist side by side, but rarely acknowledge each other, where invisible walls separate those who have from those who have not, where your postal code determines not just where you live, but how you're treated, what opportunities you receive, and whether people look you in the eye or look straight through you as if you do not exist. In this city live two people whose paths should never have crossed, whose worlds operate on entirely different frequencies, whose daily realities are so different they might as well inhabit different planets. First, there is Marcus Okafor, 32 years old, but carrying the weariness of a much older man because life has not been gentle with him. Marcus is a single father to 7-year-old Amara, a bright-eyed girl with braided hair and a smile that can light up the darkest room, a little girl who still asks when Mommy is coming home, even though she knows the answer will break both their hearts. 2 years ago, Marcus lost his wife Kioma to an illness that consumed their savings, sold their small car, and left him with medical bills that still arrive in the mail like ghosts of his helplessness. Kioma was his childhood sweetheart, the woman who believed in him when he had nothing to offer but dreams and determination, the woman who made poverty feel like abundance because love filled every corner of their tiny home. When she died, something inside Marcus died too, but he couldn't afford the luxury of grief because Amara needed food and school fees, and a father who showed up every single day, no matter how exhausted he felt. So Marcus works 3 jobs: security guard at night, watching over buildings owned by people who will never know his name, street vendor during the day, selling water and snacks to commuters who barely glance at him, and weekend handyman fixing things for neighbors. who pay him in meals and gratitude because cash is something none of them have enough of. He lives in a modest two-room apartment in a working-class neighborhood where children play football in dusty streets, where neighbors share what little they have, where community means something because survival requires it, where dignity is maintained through pride in clean, although patched clothes and respectfully greeting elders and teaching your children that poverty is a circumstance, not a character flaw. Marcus is a man of quiet dignity, deep faith, and unshakable principles, the kind of man who prays every morning thanking God for another day, who tells Amara bedtime stories about her mother so she never forgets where she comes from, who believes that how you treat people matters more than what you accumulate, who maintains his integrity even when the world seems designed to crush it. Then there is Victoria Adejimi, 38 years old and at the absolute peak of her career, a woman whose name appears in business magazines with words like powerhouse and trailblazer and unstoppable force attached to it. Victoria is the CEO of Adeyemi Pharmaceuticals, a company she built from a small import business into a major player in West African healthcare with branches in 5 countries and annual revenues that would make your head spin. She sits in a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, drives a Mercedes that gets serviced more carefully than most people get healthcare, lives in a mansion with more rooms than she can count, and wears designer everything from her perfectly tailored power suits to her imported Italian shoes. Victoria is recently divorced from a man who told her during their final argument that she had become someone he didn't recognize, someone cold and calculating, someone who valued deals over people and profit margins over presence, someone who missed their daughter's school performances because board meetings mattered more. She has a 15-year-old daughter named Zainab who attends an expensive boarding school and comes home for holidays with the kind of resentment that only blooms in children who have everything except the one thing they actually need, their mother, as undivided attention and genuine affection. Victoria worked incredibly hard to get where she has clawed her way up from humble beginnings that she now prefers not to discuss at cocktail parties, transformed herself so completely that sometimes she can barely remember the girl who grew up in a rural village where running water was a luxury and electricity was unpredictable. But somewhere in that transformation, in that relentless pursuit of success and status and security, Victoria lost something essential. She became the kind of person who measures human worth by bank accounts and job titles, who treats service workers as invisible inconveniences, rather than people with stories and struggles and dreams, who has convinced herself that her wealth and position make her inherently more valuable than those who clean her offices and serve her coffee and hold doors open while she breezes past without acknowledgement. She has built walls so high around her heart that empathy cannot scale them, cultivated an arrogance so profound that humility seems like weakness, and developed a contempt for struggle that conveniently forgets she once knew what hunger felt like. These two people, Marcus with his humble dignity and Victoria with her prideful power, are about to collide in a way that will expose the truth that our modern world works desperately hard to obscure. The truth that when crisis strips away all pretense and performance, when life and death hang in the balance and money suddenly means nothing, we discover that every human being bleeds the same color and that the person you dismissed as worthless might be the only one who can save you. This is a story about what happens when karma doesn't come as punishment, but as an opportunity for redemption. When the universe arranges circumstances so perfectly, the transformation becomes inevitable. When grace triumphs over grievance, and a man proves that true strength lies not in retaliation but in rising above. This is a story that will make you examine how you treat the people who serve you, the strangers you pass without seeing, the individuals you've categorized and dismissed based on their appearance or occupation or economic status. This is a story that asks uncomfortable questions about who we've become in our pursuit of success, and whether we've sacrificed our humanity on the altar of ambition. So settle in, open your heart, and prepare for a tale that reminds us that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is choose compassion when we have every right to choose revenge. That dignity is not determined by your bank balance, but by your character, and that the person you look down upon might one day be the only one standing between you and devastating loss. Marcus Okafor stood in the gleaming lobby of Adani Pharmaceuticals, his worn leather shoes polished to a shine that couldn't quite hide the cracks along the sides. He clutched a manila envelope containing his application for the janitorial position, his palms slightly sweaty despite the aggressive air conditioning that made the building feel like a refrigerator. Beside him sat 7-year-old Amara, swinging her legs from the expensive leather chair, her school uniform freshly pressed, even though the fabric was beginning to thin at the elbows. It was a school holiday, and Marcus had exhausted every favor trying to find childcare. But his neighbors all had their own struggles and responsibilities. He had no choice but to bring her along and pray that the interviewers would understand that desperation sometimes looks like poor planning. The receptionist had given them both a look that lasted just a fraction too long, the kind of look that makes you acutely aware of every thread that has come loose on your clothing, every sign that you're not quite polished enough for these pristine surroundings. Marcus had smiled politely, thanked her, and told Amara in a whisper to sit quietly and not touch anything because everything here probably cost more than their monthly rent. The lobby itself was a monument to success and excess, with marble floors so polished you could see your reflection. Abstract art on the walls that Marcus suspected was supposed to mean something profound, and a massive company logo in gold letters that seemed to announce that important things happened here, things that people like Marcus only facilitated by cleaning up after those who actually mattered. He had been waiting for 40 minutes, watching well-dressed executives stride through with purpose and confidence, talking on expensive phones about deals and distributions and market penetration, none of them glancing his way except to navigate around him as if he were furniture. Amara had been remarkably patient, but she was still a child, and children get thirsty and bored. She had asked softly if she could get some juice from the vending machine she'd spotted near the elevators, and Marcus had given her coins he'd been saving for their bus fare home, figuring they could walk if necessary because disappointing his daughter felt worse than tired feet. She had skipped off happily, her braids bouncing, and Marcus had watched her with that mixture of love and heartache that single parents know intimately, the constant awareness that you read trying to be two parents in one body and always falling somehow short. That's when Victoria Adeyemi had entered the building like a force of nature designer heels, clicking with authority against marble phone pressed to her ear discussing what sounded like a multi-million Naira deal with someone who clearly wasn't meeting her standards. She was beautiful in that intimidating way that success often manifests. Hair perfectly styled, makeup flawless, wearing a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Marcus made in 3 months. She moved through the lobby with the confidence of someone who owned not just the building, but possibly the very air inside it. And people instinctively moved out of her path the way water parts around a ship. Amara, clutching her juice box and not understanding the unspoken hierarchies of corporate spaces, had been walking back to her father, her eyes on the colorful package when she collided directly with Victoria's path. The impact was minor, barely worth noting, just a child accidentally bumping into an adult. But the juice box compressed in Amara's startled grip, and a stream of bright orange liquid shot out, splashing across Victoria's pristine suit, leaving a stain that spread across the expensive fabric like a small sunrise. The lobby seemed to freeze. The receptionist gasped audibly. 2 executives who'd been walking past stopped mid-stride, and Marcus felt his heart drop into his stomach as he jumped up from his chair, already apologizing before he'd even reached them. Victoria looked down at her suit, then at Amara, then around the lobby with an expression of such cold fury that it made the air conditioning feel warm by comparison. "Can't you control your child?" She'd snapped, her voice cutting through the silence like a whip. "Do you have any idea what this dress costs?" "More than you probably make in 6 months." Amara had started crying immediately, those big, heartbroken sobs that come from children who've just realized they've done something terribly wrong, even if they do and fully understand why it is so terrible. Marcus had reached them, kneeling down to comfort his daughter while simultaneously trying to address Victoria, caught between his two most basic instincts: protect his child and maintain the dignity necessary to survive in a world that was always looking for reasons to dismiss people like him. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," he'd said, his voice steady despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "It was an accident. I'll pay for the cleaning. But Victoria had cut him off with a dismissive wave of her hand, calling for security with the casual cruelty of someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to be vulnerable. "Why are low-level applicants bringing children into our headquarters? This is a professional environment, not a daycare center." Her assistant, a younger woman who looked deeply uncomfortable, had leaned in to whisper something, probably mentioning that Marcus was there for an interview. Victoria's expression had shifted from anger to something worse: disdain mixed with amusement. "Oh, the janitor position," she'd said, loud enough for nearby people to hear. "Well, I think we can safely say this interview is over. Someone who can't manage their own child certainly can't be trusted to manage our facilities." Marcus had felt the words land like physical blows, but he'd maintained his composure, gently taking Amara's hand and standing up with as much dignity as he could gather. Security had already been approaching, 2 large men in uniforms who looked apologetic but dutiful, ready to escort them out. The other people in the lobby had pretended not to watch while watching everything, that particular skill people develop when they want to observe humiliation without being associated with it. As they'd been walked toward the exit, Marcus had turned back once, catching Victoria's eye, and said something that surprised even himself with its sincerity. "I'm very sorry for the inconvenience, ma'am. God bless you." There was no sarcasm in his voice, no hidden anger, just genuine grace that seemed to confuse Victoria for a brief moment before she turned away, already back on her phone, moving on to things that actually mattered in her world. Outside in the brutal afternoon heat, Marcus had knelt down beside Amara, wiping her tears, telling her it wasn't her fault, that accidents happen and they don't define us. But inside, in that place he kept carefully guarded, he'd felt the familiar weight of systemic dismissal, the exhausting reality that people like Victoria would always see people like him as less than, as problems to be managed, rather than human beings navigating impossible circumstances with as much grace as they could manage. The bus ride home had been quiet, Amara eventually falling asleep against his shoulder, and Marcus staring out the window at the city that promised opportunity but delivered. It's so unequally, wondering how he would make next month's rent now that this job had evaporated, wondering what he would tell his daughter about how the world works without crushing the hope that kept her, believing tomorrow might be better than today. The alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 in the morning, its harsh electronic beeping cutting through the darkness of the small bedroom, where Marcus had finally fallen asleep just 2 hours earlier. He reached out with practiced efficiency, silencing it before it could wake. Amara in the next room then lay still for just a moment, gathering the energy to face another day in the relentless cycle that had become his life. His body ached in that deep way that comes from perpetual exhaustion, from muscles that never quite get enough rest, from a nervous system that's been running on adrenaline and caffeine for so long it's forgotten what genuine relaxation feels like. He thought briefly about Kioma, about how she used to wake up with him on mornings like this, how she'd make tea while he got ready, how her presence made early mornings feel less lonely. But that was before the illness, before the hospitals, before the slow, devastating realization that love and determination weren't enough to keep someone alive when medical care cost more than hope could afford. Now he woke alone in a bed that still felt too empty, in an apartment that still carried traces of her presence in the faded curtains she'd sewn and the photos on the walls showing happier times when their biggest worry was whether they could afford a nicer place, not whether they could afford to keep living. Marcus moved quietly through his morning routine, washing his face with cold water because the hot water heater had broken 3 months ago, and repairs weren't currently in the budget, brushing his teeth while mentally calculating the day ahead and which bills could be delayed another week without catastrophic consequences. He dressed in his security guard uniform, the dark pants and light blue shirt that represented his most stable income. The job that paid just enough to cover rent, if he was careful, and utilities, if he was lucky, and left almost nothing for the unexpected expenses that life seemed determined to throw at him with cruel regularity. Before leaving, he stopped in Amara's room watching her sleep in the soft pre-dawn light filtering through thin curtains, her face peaceful in a way that made his chest tight with love and terror. Because raising a daughter alone in a world this harsh felt like trying to protect a candle flame in a hurricane. He kissed her forehead, gently whispered a prayer over her that had become ritual, asking God to protect her and provide for her and somehow make up for the mother she'd lost and the father who was always working and never quite enough no matter how hard he tried. His neighbor, Mrs. Okonkwo, a widow in her 60s who understood single parenthood because she'd raised 4 children alone after her husband died, would come over at 6 to get Amara ready for school. A kindness Marcus repaid by fixing things in her apartment and sharing whatever extra food they had, the informal economy of mutual support that kept their entire neighborhood functioning when formal systems failed them. The security company van picked him up at 5, and Marcus climbed in with 5 other guards, all of them wearing the same tired expressions, all of them working these overnight shifts because day jobs didn't pay enough, and families needed feeding, and dignity required showing up no matter how exhausted you felt. They drove through the still dark city, past neighborhoods that transitioned from struggling to stable to wealthy, past the invisible borders that separated worlds until they reached the office complex where Marcus would spend the next 12 hours walking patrol routes and monitoring cameras and occasionally stopping someone who'd forgotten their ID badge, his presence simultaneously essential and invisible in that particular way security work often is. The shift was long and monotonous hours of watching and waiting, of staying alert for problems that rarely materialized, of making small talk with other guards. During brief overlaps of eating the simple lunch he depacked because buying food at the complex's cafeteria would cost half his daily wages. At 2 in the afternoon, his shift ended, but his day didn't. Marcus caught a bus to the commercial district, changed out of his uniform in a public restroom, and transformed into his second job, Identity Street vendor. He had a small cart where he sold bottled water, soft drinks, and snacks to commuters and office workers, positioning himself at a busy intersection where foot traffic was constant and competition was fierce. The work was harder than security in some ways, requiring constant engagement, calling out to potential customers, negotiating prices, dealing with the heat that made the pavement shimmer and sweat run down his back until his shirt was soaked through. But it was also more human, involving actual interactions, conversations with regular customers who learned his name and asked about Amara, moments of connection that reminded him he existed as more than just a uniform or a function. He worked until 7 in the evening, sold out his inventory when he was lucky, and went home with unsold products when he wasn't, then rushed to pick up Amara from Mrs. Okonkwo, spending the precious evening hours helping with homework, preparing dinner from whatever ingredients they had available, listening to her talk about school and friends and the dreams she had for the future. Those evening hours were sacred to Marcus, the reason he endured everything else. The moments when being a father felt less like drowning and more like the purpose that justified every sacrifice. After Amara went to bed, he had maybe an hour to himself, time he usually spent preparing for the next day, repairing clothes that were wearing out, reviewing the household budget that never quite balanced, and praying because faith was the thing that kept him from despairing completely when practical solutions seemed impossible to find. 3 nights a week he did handyman work for neighbors, fixing plumbing issues and electrical problems and broken furniture. Skills he'd learned from his own father, and that now provided small amounts of extra income and stronger community bonds. On good weeks, he managed to save a little money in the envelope hidden in his dresser, building towards some undefined future emergency that he knew would eventually come because emergencies always did. His neighborhood was a place of struggle, but also solidarity, where everyone understood what it meant to work multiple jobs and still not quite make it, where children played together while parents watched from doorways, where music played from different apartments, creating a soundtrack of resilience where people shared food when someone's situation became desperate and contributed what they could to help pay for funerals when someone's luck ran out entirely. Marcus had lived there for 3 years since Kiyoma's medical bills had forced them to move from their slightly better apartment, and he found a community that felt more like family than the biological family members who drifted away when his marriage crossed ethnic lines that apparently mattered more than love. The people here didn't judge him for working as a security guard and street vendor, didn't make him feel less than because he was doing unglamorous work, didn't question his manhood because he braided his daughter's hair and cooked meals and attended parent-teacher conferences. They saw him as he was, a man doing his best with impossible circumstances, maintaining his integrity when shortcuts would have been easier, raising a daughter with values in a world that seemed to reward their opposite. On the evening after the humiliation at Adeyemi Pharmaceuticals, Marcus sat with Amara before bedtime, helping her practice her reading, listening to her stumble over difficult words, and celebrating when she got them right. She asked him about the job interview, and he told her simply that it hadn't worked out, that God had other plans, that they would be fine because they always were. But Amara, perceptive in that way children often are, had asked the question that pierced his defenses. "Papa, why was that lady so mean to us?" Marcus had paused, choosing his words carefully, trying to teach her truth without crushing her spirit, trying to explain that some people forget that money and position don't make you better than others. That real character shows in how you treat people who can't do anything for you, that their worth wasn't determined by someone else's inability to see it. "Baby," he'd said, pulling her close, "we may not have much, but we have something that lady doesn't have. We have our character, our kindness, our ability to see God in everyone we meet. Never let anyone take that from you. Never let cruelty make you cruel." They had prayed together before she slept, Marcus's voice steady as he thanked God for another day, for Amara's health, for the roof over their heads, and asked for strength to face whatever tomorrow brought. And in the darkness, after she'd fallen asleep, Marcus had allowed himself a moment of honest emotion, of anger at injustice, of exhaustion with the relentless grind, before pulling himself together and returning to the faith and determination that had carried him through losing his wife and would carry him through whatever came next. Victoria Adeyemi's morning began at 5:30, not because necessity demanded it, but because success required discipline, the kind of regimented self-optimization that separated CEOs from middle management, winners from those who merely participated. She woke in her master bedroom, a space larger than most people's entire apartments, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city coming to life beneath her, a view that reminded her daily that she climbed higher than most people ever dreamed possible. Her personal trainer arrived at 6 for the workout session in her home gym, an hour of intense exercise that kept her body as controlled and efficient as her business operations, followed by a breakfast prepared by her housekeeper using organic ingredients sourced from expensive specialty stores, fuel calculated for optimal performance rather than enjoyment. She dressed in her walk-in closet, selecting from rows of designer suits organized by color and season, each outfit carefully chosen to project authority and success, her appearance weaponized into a tool that opened doors and closed negotiations in her favor. Everything in her morning routine was optimized, streamlined, designed to maximize productivity and minimize wasted time. Her life operated like the business she ran, efficient, profitable, and leaving no room for anything that didn't serve her upward trajectory. The drive to her office took 20 minutes in her Mercedes, moving through traffic that seemed to part instinctively for vehicles that cost as much as houses past neighborhoods she no longer really saw because they become mere geography rather than places where actual people with actual struggles lived their actual lives. She made phone calls throughout the drive, her Bluetooth connection allowing her to manage 3 different conversations before arriving at headquarters. Her assistant already waiting with a tablet full of the day's schedule, the meetings and decisions and problems that required her attention. Victoria entered Adejimi Pharmaceuticals like a general entering headquarters employees, straightening slightly as she passed her presence, commanding the kind of respect that comes from both achievement and fear from knowing that she made decisions that could end careers or launch them, depending on her assessment of value and performance. The company had been built from almost nothing, started 15 years ago when she'd seen an opportunity in pharmaceutical importation that others had missed. Grown through aggressive expansion and strategic partnerships and a willingness to make hard decisions that kept her awake at night. Initially, but eventually became routine. Now the company operated in 5 West African countries, employed over 300 people, and generated revenues that placed her among the continent's most successful female entrepreneurs, a statistic that magazines loved to publish and that she referenced frequently in interviews as evidence that gender barriers could be overcome through sheer determination and refusing to accept limitations. Her office occupied the entire 30th floor, with conference rooms and a private executive suite that featured the kind of amenities that announced success without requiring words-imported furniture, original artwork, technology that responded to voice commands, and that spectacular view that literally placed her above the city's chaos and noise. She spent her days in back-to-back meetings, negotiating with suppliers and distributors, reviewing financial projections with her CFO, making decisions about market expansion and product lines, managing the complex machinery of a successful business that required constant attention lest competitors see weakness and exploit it. Victoria was good at this, brilliant, even with an analytical mind that cut through complexity and identified core issues with a negotiating style that combined charm when necessary and intimidation when useful, with an ability to read people and situations that served her well in business, even as it isolated her personally. She had earned every success through intelligence, and hard work had sacrificed relationships and personal time and softer emotions that seemed like luxuries she couldn't afford while building something that would last, that would prove to everyone who doubted her that the poor girl from the village could not just survive but dominate in a world that preferred keeping people like her in their place. But success had changed her in ways she didn't fully recognize or acknowledge, had hardened her into someone who measured human worth by economic productivity, who saw employees as resources to be managed rather than people with lives and struggles and dreams. The empathy that had once been her strength, the understanding of hardship that had fueled her initial drive, had calcified into something closer to contempt for those who had climbed as high or accumulated as much as if poverty was a moral failing rather than a systemic reality. She treated service workers, the cleaners, and security guards and receptionists as functionally invisible, nodded at them without really seeing them, spoke about them in meetings as line items in the budget rather than individuals with families and rent payments and medical needs. When executives suggested raising wages for lower-level staff, Victoria responded with spreadsheets showing how that would impact profit margins, with arguments about market rates and competitive positioning, with a cold calculation that didn't factor in the human cost of paying people just enough to keep them desperate, but not enough to ever feel secure. She had become, without quite realizing it, the kind of person she would have hated in her youth, the kind of wealthy elite who'd looked through her when she was struggling, who treated her as less than when she was clawing her way up. Her personal life reflected the same calculated efficiency that characterized her business operations. Relationships maintained when they served purposes and discarded when they became inconvenient or demanding. Her marriage had ended 2 years ago, her husband finally leaving. After a decade of increasingly distant coexistence, after one too many missed anniversaries and forgotten conversations and moments when he tried to reach her emotionally, only to encounter the walls she'd built so high that intimacy couldn't scale them. He told her during their final argument that she'd become someone he didn't recognize, someone who valued transactions over connections, someone who'd traded her humanity for a corner office, someone who couldn't turn off the CEO persona even in her own home. Victoria had dismissed his concerns as weakness, as his inability to accept that she was simply more driven and ambitious than he was comfortable with, as jealousy masquerading as concern. She'd kept the house and most of their assets, the divorce negotiations handled by lawyers, while she focused on a merger that mattered more than the ending of a marriage that had stopped being functional years earlier. Her daughter Zainab lived primarily at boarding school, an expensive institution that provided excellent education and convenient distance, coming home for holidays when Victoria's schedule allowed quality time and staying with her father when it did. And Victoria told herself this arrangement was better for Zainab, provided stability and structure and opportunities that staying home couldn't offer. But she avoided examining too closely whether she'd chosen her daughter's boarding school for Zainab's benefit or her own convenience. The incident with Marcus and Amara hadn't registered as particularly significant in Victoria's day, just a minor annoyance in a schedule full of more important matters. A stain on expensive clothing that her assistant would handle, and a janitor applicant who'd proven unsuitable for employment. She'd been irritated, certainly, but not reflective, not questioning whether her response had been disproportionate or cruel, not considering what it felt like from the perspective of a man who'd come hoping for opportunity, only to face public humiliation. By the time her driver took her home that evening, she'd forgotten about it entirely. The incident filed away as irrelevant to Marcus, and Amara reduced to a moment of inconvenience rather than actual people whose lives she'd impacted. That was perhaps the most damning thing about who Victoria had become. Not that she was actively malicious, but that she'd developed the ability to hurt people without even noticing, to wield her power so casually that cruelty registered, merely as efficiency to move through the world, leaving damage in her wake without ever looking back to see what she'd broken. She lived in a bubble of privilege so complete that suffering became abstract, poverty became someone else's problem, and the idea that she might one day need something from the people she'd dismissed as beneath her consideration never entered her carefully constructed reality. Her evenings followed the same optimized routine as her mornings, a quick gym session or yoga class with an instructor who came to her house dinner either alone or at business functions where networking mattered more than nourishment. Phone calls with international partners in different time zones, reviewing documents and projections that her team had prepared, maybe. An hour of television before bed, though, even that felt like wasted time that could have been spent more productively. She had friends, or at least people she socialized with, other successful professionals who understood the demands of her lifestyle and didn't expect emotional depth or vulnerable connection. Relationships that existed comfortably on the surface, discussing business and travel and the incompetence of government officials without ever risking genuine intimacy. Victoria told herself she was happy, that success was its own reward, that the material comfort and professional respect she'd achieved justified whatever sacrifices had been necessary. But late at night, sometimes, in those moments between waking and sleeping when defenses lowered and truth crept in, she felt something she couldn't quite name, a hollowness that no achievement filled, a sense that she'd won some race, but couldn't remember what the prize was supposed to be, a wondering whether the girl she'd been would recognize or even like the woman she'd become. Those moments passed quickly, dismissed as fatigue or sentimentality. and morning always arrived with its demands and distractions, pulling her back into the world where she was Victoria Ademi, CEO success story. Woman who'd made it against all odds, and where questions about cost and consequence and character could be safely ignored in favor of quarterly projections and market expansion and the next deal that needed closing. 3 weeks after the incident in her building's lobby, Victoria sat in her corner office reviewing acquisition proposals when her phone rang with a number she didn't immediately recognize. An interruption she almost didn't answer because unscheduled. Calls disrupted the careful flow of her managed calendar. Something made her pick up anyway, perhaps instinct or random chance, and the voice on the other end belonged to Mrs. Adebayo, the headmistress of Zainab's boarding school, speaking in that carefully controlled tone that educators use when delivering news that parents don't want to hear. "Mrs. Ademi, I'm calling about Zainab. She collapsed during athletics today. We've called an ambulance, but I think you should meet us at Central Hospital immediately." The words hit Victoria like physical impacts, her carefully constructed control shattering instantly, papers falling from her hands as she stood abruptly, her mind racing through terrible possibilities, even as she forced herself to ask coherent questions about what happened and whether Zainab was conscious and how serious was serious. Mrs. Adebayo provided what information she could. Explained that Zainab had simply dropped during a routine run, that she'd been conscious but disoriented, that the paramedics were already on scene and taking precautions. But the uncertainty in her voice communicated more than her words did, suggested that this wasn't a simple fainting spell or dehydration, but something more concerning that required immediate parental presence. Victoria left her office without explanation, her assistant calling after her with questions about the afternoon's meetings. But she was already in the elevator, already calling her driver to bring the car around, immediately, already experiencing the particular terror that comes with being a parent when your child is in danger and you not there to protect them. The drive to Central Hospital took 30 minutes that felt like 30 hours, traffic refusing to cooperate. With her urgency, her mind conjuring increasingly catastrophic scenarios, because that's what minds do when given incomplete information and fear as fuel. She thought about Zainab, about their increasingly distant relationship, about all the time she'd chosen work over presence, about the last conversation they'd had where Zainab had asked if she could come home for the weekend and Victoria had said no because there was a conference that couldn't be missed, about the years of small rejections that had accumulated into a wall between them that neither quite knew how to dismantle. She thought about her own mother, who died when Victoria was 16, who'd worked herself to exhaustion trying to provide for her children, who Victoria had promised to honor by becoming successful and secure so that poverty could never touch her family again, and wondered with sudden devastating clarity whether she de-honored that promise or betrayed it by becoming so focused on financial security that she neglected every other kind. The hospital was chaos organized into systems, people moving with purpose through corridors that smelled of antiseptic. And fear and Victoria navigated it with the same determination she brought to business. Negotiations demanding information and updates and access to her daughter with an authority that made staff respond quickly, even when protocols suggested she should wait. They'd taken Zainab to the emergency ward, and Victoria found her in a bed surrounded by monitoring equipment, looking small and vulnerable in a way that Victoria hadn't seen in years, hadn't allowed herself to see, because acknowledging vulnerability meant confronting the way she'd failed to protect against it. Zainab was conscious, but weak, her usually vibrant face pale and drawn, and when she saw Victoria, she didn't smile or reach out, but just looked at her with an expression that held relief and resentment in equal measure, the complicated emotional mathematics of a child whose mother has been more absence than presence. Victoria took her hand, felt how cold it was, and said all the reassuring things mothers say, even when they're terrified, promised that everything would be fine, and that the doctors would figure out what happened, and that she was here now and wouldn't leave promises that felt hollow given her track record, but were nonetheless sincere in the moment. because crisis has a way of clarifying what actually matters. The doctor arrived 20 minutes later, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Oladel, who carried herself with the calm competence that comes from years of delivering difficult news to unprepared families. She asked Victoria to step into a private consultation room, a request that made Victoria's stomach drop because good news doesn't require privacy. And once they were alone with the door closed, Dr. Oladel explained the situation with clinical precision that could not quite hide the gravity of what she was saying. Zainab's blood tests had revealed a rare blood disorder, something called Bombay phenotype, a genetic condition where the body doesn't produce the H antigen that is normally present on red blood cells, making her blood type incompatible with standard transfusion protocols. The condition wasn't normally life-threatening, Dr. Oladel explained, except that Zainab was also severely anemic, her red blood cell count dangerously low, and she needed a transfusion urgently to prevent organ damage or worse. The problem was that people with Bombay phenotype could only receive blood from other people with the same rare condition, and Bombay blood type was extraordinarily uncommon, appearing in maybe 1 in 10,000 people in India, where it was first discovered, and even rarer in African populations, perhaps 1 in several 100,000 individuals. Victoria felt the ground shifting beneath her, felt her carefully constructed world revealing itself as the illusion it had always been. Because what good was wealth and power and connections when the thing your child needed couldn't be purchased at any price? How do we find this blood? She asked, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest, her mind already jumping to solutions, because that's what she did. She solved problems through resources and determination. Dr. Oladel explained that they'd already contacted the National Blood Bank, had run searches through regional databases, had reached out to international registries, but so far had found no matches available for immediate transfusion. They were launching a broader search, putting out appeals through media and social networks, testing hospital staff and anyone who came forward. But they needed to be honest about the odds. Finding a compatible donor in time was possible but far from certain, and they were working against a clock because Zainab's condition was deteriorating. How long? Victoria asked, the question barely more than a whisper. Dr. Oladel met her eyes with compassion and honesty. Maybe 48 hours before we start seeing organ complications. We're doing everything we can, Mrs. Ademi, but I need you to understand the severity of the situation. Your daughter needs a miracle, or at the very least an extraordinary coincidence. Victoria returned to Zainab's bedside in a daze, her mind spinning through her contact list mentally, trying to think of who she could call, what favors she could leverage, what resources she could deploy. But for the first time in her adult life, she was confronting a problem that her money and influence couldn't solve. That required something beyond her control. That made her feel as powerless as the girl she'd once been watching her mother deteriorate because quality healthcare was something other people could afford but her family couldn't. She held Zainab's hand and made phone calls, reaching out to business contacts and government officials and anyone who might have access to networks or information that could help. Her voice projecting confidence. She didn't feel her CEO persona activating automatically, even in crisis. The hospital launched a public appeal, announcing the urgent need for Bombay blood type donors and offering a substantial reward that Victoria had authorized without hesitation. 5 million naira for anyone who could save her daughter's life. Money that finally seemed to have a purpose beyond accumulation. The news spread through social media and radio broadcasts, and people began coming to the hospital to be tested, dozens and then hundreds. A response that would have been heartwarming if the situation wasn't so desperate, if each negative test result didn't feel like another door closing. Victoria stayed at the hospital, canceled everything on her calendar without explanation, existed in the strange timeless space that hospital vigils create where minutes stretch and hours compress, and the outside world becomes irrelevant background noise. Zainab drifted in and out of sleep, sometimes lucid enough to talk briefly, asking questions Victoria couldn't answer and making observations that cut deeper than any business rival's criticism ever had. "You're actually here," Zainab said at one point, her voice weak but clear. "You're not on your phone or distracted by work. It took me dying for you to finally pay attention." Victoria wanted to protest that Zainab wasn't dying, that they would find a donor, that everything would be fine. But the words stuck in her throat, because they both knew it might not be fine, and perhaps honesty was what this moment required rather than false reassurance. "I'm sorry," Victoria said instead, tears finally breaking through the control she'd maintained since the phone call. "I'm so sorry for not being there, for choosing everything else over you, for thinking that providing material things was the same as providing love and presence. If we get through this, I promise things will be different." Zainab looked at her with eyes that seemed older than 15, that held a wisdom born from feeling neglected and having to grow up understanding that her mother's love came with conditions and competing priorities. "You always promise things will be different, Mom, but they never are." The first day passed with no compatible donor found, hundreds of people tested, but none with the rare blood type that Zainab needed. And Victoria felt her carefully constructed faith in controllable outcomes crumbling beneath the reality that some things couldn't be managed or negotiated or overcome through sheer force of will. She sat beside Zainab's bed through the night, watching monitors and listening to the rhythmic beeping that confirmed her daughter was still alive. Still fighting, and prayed for the first time in years with genuine desperation rather than the perfunctory ritual prayer had become. She prayed to a God she'd largely forgotten about during her climb to success, a God she'd reduced to cultural tradition rather than actual presence, and she begged for intervention or mercy or just one more chance to be the mother she should have been from the beginning. The hospital staff were kind but realistic, providing updates without sugarcoating the deteriorating timeline, and Dr. Oladell sat with Victoria in the early morning hours, explaining that they were running out of time, that organ damage was beginning, that without a transfusion soon, the outcome would move from uncertain to inevitable. Victoria felt something breaking inside her that had nothing to do with her daughter's medical condition, and everything to do with the sudden recognition of who she'd become, what she'd sacrificed in her pursuit of success, what she devalued and what she deneglected, and whether any of her achievements meant anything if she lost the person who should have mattered most. Marcus heard the radio appeal while working his security shift at 2 in the morning, the overnight hours when the city slept and he walked patrol routes. Through empty parking lots and silent buildings, his footsteps echoing in spaces that bustled with activity during daylight, but belonged to security guards and cleaning crews in darkness. He had a small radio that kept him company during these lonely hours, usually tuned to stations that played old gospel music or talk programs that made the time pass more quickly. But that night he'd been switching frequencies, looking for something to keep him alert, and had landed on a news station just as they were reading an urgent public health announcement. The announcer's voice was grave and compelling, explaining that Central Hospital was searching desperately for blood donors with an extremely rare type, that a young girl's life depended on finding a match within the next 24 hours, that anyone willing to be tested should come to the hospital immediately, regardless of the hour. The announcement mentioned Bombay phenotype, specifically the medical term cutting through Marcus's tired brain and triggering a memory from 2 years ago, from the terrible months of Kioma's illness, when hospitals and blood tests and medical terminology had become his unwelcome second language. He remembered being tested back then, remembered the confusion when doctors had explained that his blood type was unusual, something called Bombay phenotype, that meant he couldn't donate to regular blood banks, but that hospitals should keep on record because it might be critically important someday. At the time, it had just been another piece of information in the overwhelming flood of medical details he was trying to process while watching his wife deteriorate, another thing that didn't seem immediately relevant when the crisis was right in front of him, demanding all his attention and resources. but now standing in an empty parking lot at 2 in the morning, listening to a desperate plea for exactly the blood type he carried in his veins. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, felt the universe or God or random chance arranging circumstances in a way that demanded response. The announcement mentioned a substantial reward, 5 million naira, an amount of money that would solve every financial problem Marcus faced. That would pay off debts and secure Amara's education and allow him to stop working 3 jobs and maybe even start the small business he'd always dreamed about. Money that represented a complete transformation of his circumstances delivered through nothing more than sharing blood that his body would replace naturally within weeks. But the announcement also mentioned the patient's mother, and though it didn't give her name, something in Marcus's gut told him exactly who this was, told him that the universe had arranged this particular test with cruel or beautiful precision depending on how he chose to respond. He finished his shift in a daze, his mind wrestling with questions that had no easy answers, walking his patrol routes automatically while internally debating what the right course of action was, what his obligations were to a child who'd done nothing wrong versus her mother who treated him with casual cruelty. What Kiyomo would tell him to do if she were still here to offer guidance. What kind of man he wanted to be and what kind of example he wanted to set for Amara. The simple answer would be to ignore it, to tell himself that he had no obligation to help people who treated him as less than human, that karma was delivering justice without his intervention, that his primary responsibility was to his own daughter, and that 5 million naira could change her entire future in ways that his current grinding poverty never would. The righteous answer would be to go immediately to save a life, because saving lives is what decent people do regardless of personal history, to prove himself better than those who'd wronged him by responding to cruelty with grace, to demonstrate that human life has value independent of how people treat you. Marcus went home after his shift exhausted, but unable to sleep, sitting in his small living room as dawn light gradually filled the space, trying to think through implications and consequences and what decision he could live with for the rest of his life. He thought about Victoria's face when she'd mocked him, the cold contempt in her eyes when she'd had him escorted from her building, the casual cruelty with which she'd dismissed his humanity and humiliated him in front of his daughter. He thought about the unfairness of a world where people like Victoria accumulated more wealth than they could spend, while people like him worked themselves to exhaustion just to survive, where cruelty often went unpunished and kindness frequently went unrewarded, where the universe seemed to favor those who'd already been favored and ignored those who most needed intervention. He thought about revenge, about how satisfying it might feel to let Victoria know that he could have saved her daughter, but chose not to make her feel powerless in the way she'd made him feel powerless, to teach her through devastating loss what it meant to be on the receiving end of dismissive cruelty. But he also thought about a 15-year-old girl who'd done nothing wrong except have the misfortune of being born to a mother who'd forgotten how to see other people as humanity, a girl who deserved life regardless of her mother's character, a child the same age his own daughter would hopefully become if poverty and circumstance allowed her to reach 15 healthy and whole. When Amara woke up, Marcus was still sitting there, still wrestling with decisions that felt too large for one person to make alone. And she climbed into his lap with that easy affection that children have before the world teaches them to be guarded, asking why he wasn't sleeping and whether everything was okay. Marcus held her close and asked her a question, trying to learn what his 7-year-old daughter's moral compass might teach him. "Baby, if someone was mean to us, really mean, but then they needed our help to save someone they loved, what do you think we should do?" Amara had looked at him with those clear eyes that had not yet learned to calculate cost-benefit analysis or measure kindness based on whether it would be reciprocated, and said something that cut through all his complex reasoning with simple clarity. "Mama used to say that when someone is mean to us, it says something about them, but when we're mean back, it says something about us. She said we should be kind even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, because that's when it matters most." Marcus felt tears burning behind his eyes, felt Kioma's presence in their daughter's words, felt the answer he'd been circling finally becoming clear, not through complex moral reasoning but through simple human decency. He called Mrs. Okonkwo to watch Amara, explaining briefly that something urgent had come up, and caught a bus to Central Hospital, still wearing his security uniform because there hadn't been time to change, and because it didn't matter what he looked like if his blood could save a life. The hospital was chaotic when he arrived, dozens of people still waiting to be tested, despite the early hour a response to the public appeal that spoke well of human nature, even if most of these volunteers would turn out not to be matches. Marcus joined the line, gave his information to a harried nurse who looked too tired to process another hopeful face, explained that he knew he had Bombay phenotype from previous testing and just needed confirmation. The nurse's expression changed immediately, fatigue replaced by sharp attention, and she'd called for a doctor to come immediately, explaining that they might have found what they'd been desperately searching for. They drew his blood right there in the emergency department rather than making him wait for the lab's normal processing schedule, and Marcus watched the vial fill with dark red liquid that might be the difference between life and death for someone he'd never met. Blood that carried no memory of grudges or humiliation, but just cells doing what cells do, offering oxygen and life to whoever needed it regardless of social class or past interactions. The test results came back within an hour, confirmed what Marcus had already known. He was a perfect match, the only match they'd found after testing hundreds of people, the one in several 100,000 coincidence that the doctor had called a miracle. The medical team moved quickly once they had confirmation, explaining the donation process and getting his consent and making arrangements for the transfusion. Their relief palpable because they'd been watching a child deteriorate and had been running out of hope that intervention would arrive in time. Marcus signed the consent forms and asked only one question before they began the process. The reward they mentioned on the radio, I don't want it. Is there a way to make that clear? The doctor had looked at him with confusion and then something closer to awe, asking why he would turn down 5 million naira when the money was being offered specifically because someone wanted to pay for this miracle. Marcus had thought about how to explain his reasoning, thought about Victoria and dignity and what kind of man he wanted to be, and finally just said simply, because that's not why I'm here. I'm here because a child needs help, and I can provide it. That's reason enough. The medical team prepared Marcus for the blood donation with efficient professionalism, hooking him up to equipment that would draw what Zainab needed while monitoring his vitals to ensure he stayed safe throughout the process, explaining that they were taking more than a standard donation because of the urgency, but still within limits that his body could handle and replace naturally. Marcus lay back on the hospital bed, watching his blood flow through transparent tubes toward bags that would soon be transferred to a girl whose face he'd never seen but whose mother he remembered with perfect clarity. The process took about an hour, during which Marcus prayed quietly and thought about the strange paths that life takes. How 3 weeks ago he'd been humiliated and rejected and escorted from a building, and now his blood was literally saving the life of the woman's daughter who'd done the rejecting. How the universe or God or whatever force arranged these things had created this moment of absolute dependence where all Victoria's wealth and power meant nothing compared to what Marcus's body could freely give. The nurse monitoring him was kind, making small talk to keep him comfortable, mentioning how worried the mother had been, how she'd stayed by her daughter's bedside for 2 days straight, how this donation was literally the answer to desperate prayers. And Marcus listened without revealing that he knew exactly who the mother was and what kind of person she'd proven herself to be. When the donation was complete, they had Marcus rest and drink juice to help his body recover. Standard protocol that he followed obediently while his mind remained occupied with questions about what would happen next. Whether he'd see Victoria, whether she'd recognize him, what her response would be when she realized that the man she'd treated as less than human now held her daughter's life in his hands. Part of him wanted to confront her, to make her acknowledge the cruel irony of the situation, to see recognition and shame dawn across her face as she connected the dots between the maze janitor applicant she mocked and the blood donor who saved her daughter. But another part, the part that Kiyoma's influence and his own faith had cultivated, just wanted to leave quietly, to know he'd done the right thing without needing acknowledgement or appreciation, to demonstrate that real character doesn't require an audience and that genuine kindness isn't performed for recognition, but offered simply because it's right. The doctor came by to thank him personally, explaining that Zainab's transfusion was already underway and her body was responding well, that he'd literally saved her life, that the family was overwhelmingly grateful, even though they didn't yet know his identity, and Marcus felt it. Satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge or validation, and everything to do with knowing that a child would get to grow up because he'd chosen compassion over bitterness. In Zainab's hospital room several floors above, Victoria sat by her daughter's bedside, watching the transfusion with an intensity that suggested she could will it to work through sheer force of attention, watching the blood flow into Zainab's veins, carrying with it the possibility of life and recovery, and all the futures. Victoria had been terrified they wouldn't have. Dr. Oladell had explained that they'd found a match, that the donor was downstairs right now giving blood, that this was the miracle they'd been praying for. And Victoria had felt relief so profound it was almost painful, felt tension she'd been holding for 2 days finally releasing as she realized her daughter would survive this crisis. She'd asked about the donor, wanted to know who this person was so she could thank them properly, offered the reward express. Gratitude that transcended words, but the medical team had been vague, mentioning only that the donor had specifically requested anonymity and had refused any reward. Information that puzzled Victoria, because in her experience, everyone had a price. Everyone wanted something. Nobody gave this kind of gift without expecting recognition or compensation. What kind of person refuses 5 million naira for saving a life? She'd asked Dr. Oladell, genuinely confused by this behavior that didn't fit her understanding of how people operated. The doctor had smiled slightly and said something that Victoria didn't quite understand yet, wouldn't understand until later when all the pieces connected. The kind of person whose reasons for helping have nothing to do with money. Zainab's color began improving within an hour of the transfusion, starting her vitals, stabilizing her body, responding exactly as the doctors had hoped, and Victoria felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she held her daughter's hand and whispered promises about second chances and being better and never taking another moment for granted. She thought about the stranger who was downstairs right now, giving their blood to save someone they'd never met. Thought about the kind of character that required thought her own life, and whether she'd ever done anything that's selfless or that kind, and realized with uncomfortable clarity that she probably hadn't, that her charitable donations were tax-deductible, and her good deeds were usually performative, and she never actually sacrificed anything meaningful for someone who couldn't offer something in return. The experience of helplessness, of being unable to solve a problem through wealth or connections, of having to depend on someone else's generosity had cracked something open in Victoria's carefully constructed sense of self, had revealed uncomfortable truths about who she'd become and what she valued, and whether the life she'd built was actually worth the person she'd had to become to build it. She'd spent 2 days confronting her own mortality through her daughter's crisis. 2 days unable to work or distract herself or hide behind professional competence. 2 days forced to sit with fear and regret and the recognition of all the ways she'd failed at the things that should have mattered most. Dr. Oladell came by after the transfusion was complete, confirming that everything had gone perfectly, that Zainab would need monitoring but should make a full recovery, that the donor had been released and gone home after being given instructions about rest and hydration and when to expect his body to have fully replaced what he'd given. Victoria insisted again on thanking the donor personally, on at least knowing who Dee saved her daughter, so she could find some way to express gratitude even if he wouldn't accept financial reward, and Dr. Oladell had hesitated before mentioning that the donor was still in the building in a recovery area downstairs, and that she could speak with him briefly if she insisted, though the hospital generally respected donor privacy when requested. Victoria immediately insisted needed to put a face to the miracle, needed to shake this person's hand and look them in the eye and try to understand the kind of human being who gave so freely what she hoarded so carefully, and Dr. Oladell had agreed to check whether the donor would consent to a brief meeting, leaving Victoria with her sleeping daughter and her jumbled thoughts, practicing mentally what she would say to adequately thank someone who'd given her everything back when she thought it was lost forever. The nurse came 15 minutes later to say that the donor had agreed to see her briefly, and Victoria followed her downstairs to a recovery area where several other blood donors sat resting after their contributions. Regular people who'd responded to the public appeal, hoping they might be able to help. Their presence a reminder that kindness existed even in a world that often seemed dominated by selfishness and cruelty. The nurse led her to a bed partially hidden by a curtain, pulled it back, and Victoria found herself looking at a man in a security guard uniform who was sitting up drinking juice. A man whose face she recognized with the kind of sick-dropping sensation that comes when reality rearranges itself in ways you weren't prepared for. A man who she last seen being escorted out of her building by security while his daughter cried, and she'd turned away to more important matters without a second thought. Marcus looked back at her with calm eyes that held no malice, but also no eagerness to make this comfortable for her, and Victoria felt her carefully prepared speech dissolve into incoherent noise in her throat as understanding crashed through her awareness like a wave, as she realized that the man she'd mocked and dismissed and treated as less than human had just saved her daughter's life, had given freely what she desperately needed after she'd given him nothing but contempt and humiliation. Victoria stood frozen in the doorway of the recovery area, her mind struggling to process the impossible coincidence that wasn't a coincidence at all, but rather the universe demonstrating its own sense of justice or irony, or perhaps just the interconnectedness of lives the privilege allows some people to pretend do and touch theirs. Marcus watched her face cycle through recognition and shock, and something that might have been horror as she connected the dots between the janitor applicant from 3 weeks ago and the blood donor who just saved her daughter. Watched her carefully constructed composure crack and splinter as the full weight of what had happened settled over her. The recovery area was quiet except for the distant sounds of the hospital, other donors resting in nearby beds behind curtains that provided the illusion of privacy, nurses moving through checking on people who'd given pieces of themselves to help strangers, the ordinary machinery of human kindness operating around them, while Victoria experienced something closer to a spiritual earthquake. She tried to speak several times, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Her CEO confidence that could command boardrooms and intimidate competitors utterly inadequate to address this situation. This moment where power dynamics had reversed so completely that she was left vulnerable and exposed while he sat calmly holding all the cards. You. She finally managed a single word carrying volumes of disbelief and recognition and questions she didn't know how to ask, and Marcus nodded slightly in acknowledgement, his expression neutral and unreadable, not offering her any way to navigate this gracefully or any path to make sense of what had happened. Victoria's mind was racing through their previous encounter, replaying her words and actions with the cruel clarity that hindsight provides. Hearing herself say that his daughter was an inconvenience and that he couldn't be trusted to clean her facilities and that everything about him was beneath her consideration, remembering how she'd turned away from his quiet dignity and his simple blessing without remorse or second thought, because people like him were functionally invisible in her world. And now that invisible person had literally saved her daughter's life, had given blood when he had every reason to refuse, had responded to her cruelty with the kind of grace that she was beginning to realize she'd never demonstrated in her entire climb to success. The shame that crashed through her was physical, making her knees weak and her chest tight, making her want to simultaneously apologize and flee, and somehow undo every interaction they'd ever had. The kind of shame that comes not from being caught doing something wrong, but from being confronted with who you actually are versus who you convinced yourself you were. Marcus finally spoke, his voice quiet and steady, cutting through her spiraling thoughts with a simple question that reoriented the entire situation. "How is your daughter doing?" The question was sincere, absent of sarcasm or performative concern, just genuine interest in whether his blood had done what it was supposed to do, whether the girl he'd never met was recovering. And somehow that sincerity made everything worse, because Victoria realized he'd done this not to teach her a lesson or make a point, but simply because a child needed help and he could provide it. She's responding well," Victoria managed, her voice coming out hoarse and uncertain. "The doctor says she'll make a full recovery. Because of you. Because of what you ... double quotes. Her voice broke completely, words failing under the weight of what she owed him and what she'd done to him, tears streaming down her face in a way that hadn't happened since childhood. The kind of tears that come from places deeper than circumstance and touch something fundamental about who you are and what you've become. Marcus handed her a tissue from the box on his bedside table, a simple gesture of human kindness that made her cry harder because she'd been cruel to him and he was still treating her with dignity. She sat down in the chair beside his bed without asking permission, her legs refusing to hold her anymore, her whole body shaking with the force of recognition and regret. And Marcus waited patiently while she tried to gather herself enough to speak coherently. "Why?" She finally asked, the question encompassing everything. "Why did you save her? Why did you come when you knew who I was? Why did you respond to cruelty with grace? Why are you a better person then? I am, despite having every material disadvantage. Why does the universe work this way, where wealth doesn't correlate with worth, and success doesn't mean you're actually good?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Victoria looked at him properly for the first time, really seeing him as a human being rather than a role or function, seeing the exhaustion in his face that came from working multiple jobs and raising a child alone and surviving circumstances that would have broken her, seeing the dignity that poverty couldn't diminish and that her contempt hadn't touched, seeing a quality of character that she'd spent a lifetime failing to develop while congratulating herself on achievements that suddenly seemed embarrassingly hollow by comparison. "Because she's someone's child," Marcus finally said, his voice carrying the weight of his own loss and love of being a parent who understood what it meant to fear for your child's life and to want desperately to protect them from harm. "Just like my Amara. Life is precious, ma'am. All life." The words were simple, but they landed like accusations because Victoria knew she didn't actually believe that all life was precious, knew she'd spent years operating as if some lives mattered more than others, as if the people who served her and cleaned her offices and guarded her buildings were somehow less valuable than the executives she networked with and the clients she courted, as if poverty was evidence of lesser worth rather than just a circumstance of birth and opportunity, and sometimes nothing more than luck. She thought about Amara, the little girl whose juice had spilled on her dress, the child she dismissed as an inconvenience, and realized with sick clarity that she'd treated that child with contempt while that child's father was the kind of man who'd save her own child without hesitation or expectation of reward. Victoria opened her mouth to apologize, to try to find words adequate to express how sorry she was, how ashamed she felt, how grateful she was not just for Zainab's life, but for the demonstration of what human goodness actually looked like. But Marcus spoke before she could begin her practiced CEO apology. "You don't need to apologize to me," he said, his tone matter-of-fact rather than harsh. "What you did 3 weeks ago, That was between you and God and your own conscience. I made peace with it that same day because holding on to anger would hurt me more than it hurt you. But maybe you should think about all the other people you've treated the way you treated me, all the people whose names you don't know and whose humanity you don't acknowledge, and ask yourself who you want to be. The words were spoken kindly, but they cut deeper than any accusation could have because they were true, because Victoria knew she'd treated countless people exactly that way, and left a trail of casual cruelty behind her that she'd never look back at, because successful people don't have time for guilt or reflection or questioning whether their achievements came at costs that shouldn't have been acceptable. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she'd worked hard and earned her success and didn't owe anyone anything. But the defenses rang hollow even in her own mind, because sitting there in a hospital recovery room, looking at a man who saved her daughter, despite having every reason not to, she couldn't sustain the narrative that had carried her this far. The truth was becoming unavoidable. She'd become the villain in stories like this, the wealthy, cruel person who looks down on the struggling hero, and the only thing that had prevented her from recognizing it before was that she never had to confront the consequences of who she was. "I don't know who I want to be," she admitted, the words coming out almost as a whisper, the kind of honesty that her professional life never allowed, and her personal life had stopped requiring years ago. "I thought I knew. I thought success meant I was doing something right, that the fact I'd climbed so high meant I was worthy, I guess. But watching my daughter almost die and realizing I couldn't save her, that all my money and power were useless, and then discovering that you, someone I treated as less than nothing, were the only one who could help. She trailed off, unable to articulate the complete dissolution of her worldview that had occurred over the past 2 days. Marcus looked at her with something that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't condemnation either. Just a clear-eyed assessment from someone who'd lived long enough and struggled enough to understand human complexity. Success didn't make you cruel, Mom. You chose that. And you can choose something different, but only if you actually want to change and not just feel better about what happened. His directness startled her. People didn't talk to Victoria Adeyemi this way, didn't challenge her or question her or suggest she needed to fundamentally examine herself, and the shock of it was almost refreshing in its honesty after years of people telling her what she wanted to hear. "I do want to change," she said, not sure if it was true, but needing to believe it might be, needing to think that this moment could be a turning point rather than just another experience she'd eventually file away and forget once the crisis passed and life returned to normal. "I don't know how, but I want to be someone my daughter doesn't resent, someone who actually deserves the success I've achieved, someone who remembers that the people who clean my offices and guard my buildings are human beings with their own struggles and dreams and worth." Marcus nodded slowly, seeming to accept that she was sincere, even if sustainability remained uncertain, and then said something that Victoria would remember for the rest of her life. Words that would echo in her mind during future decisions and difficult moments when the easy path conflicted with the right path. "My wife used to say that character isn't what you are when people are watching or when it benefits you to be good. Character is what you are when you have power over someone and could get away with treating them poorly, but choose kindness anyway. Character is what you are when nobody is keeping score, and there is no reward except knowing you did right." Victoria felt those words settle into her chest like stones, heavy and solid and impossible to ignore. And she understood that she was being offered something more valuable than forgiveness. She was being offered a mirror that showed her exactly who she'd become, and a suggestion that maybe she could become someone different. She sat there for a long moment, just breathing and crying, and trying to integrate these new, uncomfortable truths into her understanding of herself, while Marcus waited patiently, in the way that people who've suffered learn to wait without expecting anything, but willing to give space for transformation if it was going to happen. Victoria wiped her face with tissues that Marcus had continued to offer without comment, gradually regaining enough composure to speak without her voice breaking every few words, though the trembling in her hands remained as physical evidence of how thoroughly this encounter had shaken her. She looked at Marcus directly, forcing herself to maintain eye contact even though shame made her want to look away, forcing herself to be present for this conversation because he deserved at least that much after what he'd given. The reward, she started, her mind automatically reaching for the transactional solutions that had always worked for her before. The way money could solve problems and smooth over complications and create obligations disguised as gratitude. Please, you have to take the 5 million naira. It's the least I can do after what you've done, after saving Zainab's life. Marcus shook his head before she'd even finished speaking, his expression making clear that he'd already considered and rejected this path multiple times before she'd arrived. I don't need your money, ma'am. I didn't do this for a reward. Taking money would make this a transaction, and that's not what this was. This was one human being helping another because help was needed. Let it be that. His refusal frustrated Victoria in ways she was struggling to articulate, because in her world everything was negotiable and everyone had a price, and his unwillingness to accept payment violated the rules by which she understood human interaction. But she also recognized, with uncomfortable insight, that her frustration came partly from the fact that money was the easy solution, that paying him would have allowed her to feel she settled the debt and could move forward without the ongoing obligation of actually changing who she was. Then tell me what I can do, she insisted, needing some way to channel the gratitude and guilt that were mixing together in her chest like competing chemicals. There has to be something I can offer, some way to acknowledge what you've done. Marcus was quiet for a moment, seeming to actually consider her question rather than dismiss it automatically, and Victoria waited with an intensity that would have been familiar to anyone who'd seen her in business negotiations, leaning forward, slightly as if she could will him to give her an answer that would provide some path forward through this situation. If you really want to honor what happened here, Marcus finally said, his words measured and thoughtful, then honor it by remembering this moment. Not just today, when everything is raw and real, but next month and next year, when it would be easier to go back to how things were before. You said you have hundreds of employees. Pay them fair wages. Give them dignity. See them as people instead of line items in your budget. You have resources and influence. Use them to lift people up instead of stepping on them as you climb higher. You have a daughter who, just watching how you treat the people you have power over, show her the wealth doesn't make you better than anyone. It just gives you more responsibility to be kind. His words were spoken without anger or judgment, just clear, honest assessment of what redemption might actually look like if Victoria was serious about wanting change rather than just wanting to feel better about what had happened. Victoria felt each suggestion land like an assignment, like concrete actions she could take rather than vague promises about being better, and she found herself nodding, even as part of her mind was already calculating the cost implications and logistical complications of actually implementing these changes. But Marcus wasn't finished, his voice taking on a slight edge that suggested he understood exactly what Victoria was thinking and wanted to challenge the calculations happening behind her eyes. The thing is, ma'am, I've met people like you before. People who have moments of clarity when crisis forces them to see how they've been living, who make promises about changing, who genuinely mean it in the moment. But then life goes back to normal, and it's easier to slip back into old patterns, because those patterns are comfortable and profitable and don't require the constant work that actual transformation demands. So if you're serious about wanting to be different, you have to decide right now, while it's hard and uncomfortable, that you're going to do the work even when it costs you something, even when kindness isn't convenient, even when treating people well cuts into your profit margins or forces you to slow down or makes you less competitive in the short term. Victoria felt defensive resistance rising in her chest at his implicit doubt about her sincerity, wanted to argue that he didn't know her well enough to make these assumptions, But she forced herself to actually listen instead of defend, because maybe he was right. Maybe she did have a history of promising change and then finding reasons why change wasn't practical. "I understand why you doubt me," she admitted. The words difficult but necessary. Acknowledgement that her track record didn't support confidence in her transformation. "I've probably had other moments where I saw my own cruelty and promised myself I'd be better, and then forgot about it once the moment passed. But this is different. Having to watch my daughter almost die, feeling completely powerless, and then realizing that you, someone I'd treated terribly, were the only person who could save her. I don't think I can go back to who I was before this. I don't think my conscience will let me." She paused, gathering courage to make a commitment that felt more binding than any business contract she'd ever signed. "I'm going to implement a living wage initiative at my company starting immediately. I'm going to create employee respect programs and proper channels for staff to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. I'm going to establish a scholarship fund for employees' children so that people like you don't have to work 3 jobs to afford their kids' education. And I'm going to do it not because it's good PR or tax advantageous, but because it's right and because I should have been doing it all along." Marcus studied her face for a long moment, seeming to assess whether her words came from genuine commitment or just emotional reaction to crisis, and Victoria found herself hoping desperately that he'd believe her, even though she wasn't entirely sure she believed herself yet. "That would be a good start," he finally said, his tone neither congratulatory nor skeptical, just accepting of her stated intention, while recognizing that intentions were just the beginning of what change required. "But the real test won't be implementing those programs. The real test will be how you treat the next person who can't do anything for you, who you'll never see again, who won't be in a position to call you out if you're cruel. That's when you'll discover whether you've actually changed or just made changes." His insight was uncomfortably accurate, cutting through the performative aspects of her planned initiatives to the fundamental question of whether she altered who she was at her core, rather than just what she did in public view. Victoria felt exposed by his clear-eyed assessment, felt seen in ways that she typically avoided by surrounding herself with people who were either too dependent or too deferential to challenge her directly. "You're right," she acknowledged, no longer trying to defend or justify herself, but just accepting the truth of what he was saying, accepting that transformation was going to be harder and more ongoing than implementing some corporate programs, and declaring herself reformed. "I've spent so long measuring success by profit and status that I forgot to measure whether I was actually becoming a better person. I built a company and lost myself in the process, and I am only realizing now how much of my humanity I traded away for success. That doesn't actually mean anything if it is built on treating people as less than human." She took a shaky breath, feeling the full weight of that recognition settle over her. "Your wife sounds like she was an amazing woman, and your daughter is lucky to have a father who models this kind of character for her. Zainab. Zainab barely knows me anymore. I've been so absent, so focused on work that I didn't realize I was teaching her that love is conditional, and people are disposable if they don't serve your ambitions." The admission hurt to speak aloud, bringing tears back to Victoria's eyes as she confronted the way she failed her own daughter while chasing success that was supposed to be for her daughter's benefit. Marcus's expression softened slightly at the mention of Amara, a father's love evident in the way his face changed when thinking about his child, and he spoke with a gentleness that hadn't been present before. "Your daughter is still alive, ma'am. You still have time to know her, to show her that people can change, to teach her different values than the ones you've been modeling. That as a gift that not every parent gets. My Amara won't have her mother at her graduation or her wedding or any of the moments that matter. Don't waste the gift you've been given by going back to how things were." His words carried the authority of someone who'd lost what Victoria had almost lost, who knew intimately what it meant to be left with regrets and what-ifs instead of opportunities for redemption. and Victoria felt the truth of his perspective settle into her bones. She thought about Zainab upstairs, recovering about all the years they still could have together. If Victoria chose to prioritize presence over profit, about the kind of mother she could still become if she was willing to do the work. "Thank you," Victoria said finally, the words inadequate but sincere, carrying gratitude not just for saving Zainab's life, but for this conversation, for the mirror he'd held up showing her who she'd become, for the possibility of transformation that he was offering, despite having every reason to simply take satisfaction in her suffering and leave her to figure things out alone. "I know saying thank you isn't enough, and I know you don't want money. But please know that what you did today, both saving my daughter and talking to me honestly, even when it would have been easier to just walk away, has changed my life in ways you probably won't ever see, but that are real nonetheless." Marcus nodded acceptance of her gratitude, then began slowly standing up from the hospital bed, steady on his feet despite having donated significant blood volume, preparing to leave and return to his life of multiple jobs and single parenthood and dignity maintained in the face of ongoing struggle. Victoria stood too, not wanting this moment to end because ending it meant returning to her regular life where the clarity of crisis might fade and old patterns might reassert themselves. "Wait," she said as Marcus moved toward the door. One more thing she needed to say before he disappeared back into the city as vast population of people she'd never properly seen. "Your daughter, Amara, I owe her an apology too. What I said to her, how I made her feel that day. She didn't deserve that. No child deserves to be treated that way." Marcus paused, turning back to look at her, and for the first time Victoria saw something other than neutral assessment in his eyes. Maybe a hint of protectiveness, maybe uncertainty about whether he wanted Victoria anywhere near his daughter after what had happened. "Maybe one day," he said carefully, "if your actions over the coming months show that you've actually changed and aren't just saying what you think you should say right now, maybe there could be a time when that apology would mean something. But right now, what Amara needs is to see her father and know he's okay. And what you need is to focus on your own daughter and the relationship you're trying to rebuild." His gentle boundary setting was wise and appropriate, a reminder that redemption wasn't instantaneous and that some trust had to be earned back slowly over time rather than restored through a single conversation or gesture. Victoria accepted the boundary with a nod, recognizing that she had no right to demand forgiveness or access, that she'd done the harm, and he had every right to protect his daughter from further interaction until and unless he decided otherwise. "I understand. Please just know that when the time is right, if it ever is, I truly am sorry for how I treated both of you." Marcus gave her one last long look, an assessment that seemed to be taking stock of whether this encounter had planted seeds that might actually grow into lasting change, or whether this was just another performance from someone skilled at performing, and then he nodded once, turned, and walked out of the recovery area, leaving Victoria standing alone, surrounded by the quiet beeping of medical equipment and the weight of promises she'd made to herself about becoming someone better than she'd been. She watched him go, this man who worked as a security guard and street vendor, who'd lost his wife and was raising his daughter alone, who possessed more real wealth in his character than Victoria had accumulated in all her financial success, and she felt something crack open in her chest that had been sealed shut for years, a possibility of becoming human again in ways that mattered, in ways that couldn't be measured by profit margins or status symbols, in ways that might actually make her worthy of her daughter's love and respect. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Victoria's office, the same office where she'd spent years measuring success by quarterly earnings and market share. But the woman sitting behind the desk was not quite the same person who deoccupied this space 6 months earlier, or at least she was trying not to be, working daily to align her actions with the commitments she'd made in a hospital recovery room when crisis had stripped away all pretense. The changes had been gradual but substantial, implemented with the same determination, Victoria had once applied to business expansion, but now directed toward creating the kind of company culture that respected human dignity alongside profit maximization. The Living Wage Initiative had been her first major act upon returning to work, announcing to a skeptical board that Adaimi Pharmaceuticals would be raising base pay for all employees to a level where full-time work actually covered basic needs without requiring second jobs or constant financial anxiety. The board had resisted predictably presenting financial projections showing how this would impact shareholder returns and competitive positioning, but Victoria had held firm with a conviction that surprised them, and herself explaining that a company built on the exploitation of its workers was not a company she wanted to lead anymore, regardless of what it cost her personally. The implementation had been more complex than simply announcing new wages, requiring restructuring of pay scales and negotiations with department heads and careful financial planning to ensure the company remained viable while treating people fairly. But Victoria had worked through each complication with focus that would have been familiar to anyone who'd seen her in business negotiations. Except now she was negotiating for people's dignity rather than her own profit. She'd also established clear protocols for employee concerns, creating genuinely anonymous channels where staff could raise issues about working conditions or management behavior without fear of retaliation. And she followed through on disciplinary action when supervisors were found to be treating employees with the kind of casual cruelty that Victoria recognized from her own past behavior. The scholarship fund had been launched with fanfare that Victoria tried to minimize because she was learning slowly that doing good things didn't require public congratulation. That real change happened in unglamorous details rather than press releases. That the single mother working in accounting, who could now afford her son's university fees, didn't care about Victoria's motives as long as the help was real and sustained. But the deeper changes were more personal and harder to quantify, showing up in small moments throughout her days that accumulated into a different way of moving through the world. Victoria now knew the names of the people who cleaned her office, stopped to ask about their families, learned that the woman who emptied her trash was putting 3 children through school alone after her husband's death, and the man who vacuumed the carpets was saving money to bring his elderly mother from the village for medical treatment she couldn't get in rural areas. She'd started arriving at the office earlier to chat with night security guards finishing their shifts, hearing their stories and struggles, understanding that the person wearing a uniform was carrying the same hopes and fears and complicated family dynamics as the executives she'd always considered her peers. She made a point of eating occasionally in the staff cafeteria rather than having meals brought to her office, sitting with different employees and genuinely listening to their perspectives on company operations, learning things about inefficiencies and problems that her insulated executive position had prevented her from seeing, discovering that the people doing the actual work often had better ideas for improvement than the consultants she'd been paying exorbitant fees for their supposedly expert advice. The transformation wasn't seamless or complete. Victoria still felt frustration when kindness slowed down decision-making, still caught herself making calculations about people's worth based on their positions, still struggled with the deeply ingrained patterns that success in corporate culture had reinforced for decades. But she'd learned to notice these moments now, to pause and reconsider, to ask herself whether she was responding with the character she wanted to have or the habits she was trying to unlearn. She'd started therapy to something she'd always dismissed as self-indulgent but now recognized as necessary for unpacking years of trauma and coping mechanisms that had led her to equate wealth with worth that had made her cruel as protection against remembering her own vulnerable origins. The therapist helped her understand that her contempt for struggling people had been displaced self-hatred, that treating others as less than was. How she'd tried to escape the internalized shame of her own humble beginnings, that real security could not come from putting distance between herself and poverty, but only from accepting her full story, including the parts she'd tried to forget. Her relationship with Zainab had been the focus of her most intentional efforts, clearing her schedule to be present for dinners and school events, having actual conversations where she listened more than she solved, rebuilding trust that had eroded over years of absence and conditional attention. Zainab was slowly responding to the changes, slowly allowing herself to hope that maybe this version of her mother would last, though. Victoria could still see skepticism in her daughter's eyes during moments when work calls interrupted family time, or when Victoria slipped back into CEO mode during what was supposed to be personal time. They'd had honest conversations about the past, about Victoria's failures as a mother, about the ways that chasing success had made Victoria lose sight of why she was succeeding in the first place. Conversations that hurt, but that were necessary for anything real to grow between them. Zainab had asked about the blood donor, curious about the person who'd saved her life, and Victoria had explained carefully about Marcus and their previous encounter, and how his grace had sparked her attempts at transformation. Watching her daughter process the reality that her mother had been cruel and had needed to be taught compassion by someone she'd mistreated. As the months passed and Victoria's changes proved more than temporary reaction to crisis, as employees began believing that the improvements were genuine, rather than performative, as the company's culture shifted gradually towards something that balanced profit with human dignity, Victoria had begun thinking about finding Marcus again, not to force an apology on Amara or to demonstrate her transformation for validation, but simply to let him know that the seeds he planted in that hospital conversation were growing, that she was actually doing the work he'd challenged her to do. She resisted the urge to look him up through her security contacts or use her resources to track him down, recognizing that would violate the boundary he'd set and would demonstrate exactly the kind of power misuse she was trying to unlearn. Instead, she'd waited hoping that the universe or God or whatever force had brought them together the first. Time might create another opportunity when the timing was right, when she had something to show rather than just promises to make. The opportunity came unexpectedly through one of her new initiatives. They'd been reviewing applications for management positions and had implemented blind resume screening to reduce bias, removing names and personal details, so candidates were evaluated purely on qualifications and experience. One application had stood out for an operations manager position, someone with extensive practical knowledge of security systems and facility management, someone whose references described them as reliable and ethical and beloved by coworkers for their integrity and kindness, someone who lacked formal credentials but demonstrated the kind of practical wisdom that credentials couldn't capture. Victoria had been impressed enough to request an interview, and when the HR department had sent her the candidate's full information for scheduling, she'd seen the name Marcus Okafor and felt her heart jump in her chest, felt the universe's sense of timing, creating another moment of intersection between their lives. She'd sat with the information for a full day, questioning her own motives, wondering if offering him a job would be genuine opportunity or patronizing charity, consulting with her therapist about whether this was appropriate or whether she'd be using her power in ways that Marcus might find uncomfortable or coercive. She'd finally decided to proceed with the interview, but to be completely transparent about her motivations and to give Marcus full autonomy to refuse without pressure, to make it clear that this was a genuine job offer based on qualifications, not charity based on past interaction, but also to acknowledge that she owed him something beyond professional courtesy. The day of the interview arrived, and Victoria found herself more nervous than she'd been in years. Nervous in a way that had nothing to do with business outcomes and everything to do with whether Marcus would see evidence of actual change or just sophisticated performance, whether her 6 months of work would register as genuine transformation or just temporary adjustment. She'd asked her assistant to bring him straight to her office rather than making him wait in the lobby where their first encounter had occurred, a small consideration that she hoped demonstrated attention to how her spaces might feel different, depending on which door you entered through. When Marcus walked into her office wearing a suit that was probably borrowed, based on how carefully he carried himself in it, looking at her with Cautious curiosity rather than the contempt she would have deserved, Victoria felt her carefully prepared opening remarks dissolve into simple, honest greeting. "Mr. Okafor, thank you for coming. Please, sit down. Can I get you anything? Coffee, water, tea?" Marcus sat in the expensive chair across from Victoria's desk. The power dynamics of their interaction shifted from their hospital encounter, but still unequal in ways that money and position always create. Though Victoria was consciously trying to minimize the intimidation factor by keeping her body language open and her tone respectful rather than commanding. They looked at each other for a moment in silence, both aware of the weight their shared history brought to what was nominally just a job interview, both uncertain exactly how to navigate this interaction that carried significance far beyond employment discussions. Victoria broke the silence first, deciding that transparency was the only approach that honored what had passed between them. "I want to be completely honest about why I asked you here. Your application stood out based purely on your qualifications and experience. Our screening process removes identifying information specifically to reduce bias, so I didn't know it was you when I selected you for an interview. But when I learned your identity, I had to decide whether to proceed or whether that would be inappropriate given our history." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I decided to proceed because I believe you genuinely qualified for this position, and because I wanted the chance to show you not just tell you that I've been trying to change in the ways you challenged me to change 6 months ago." Marcus listened without interrupting, his face difficult to read, and Victoria continued before her nerve failed. "The operations manager position is real. It's not charity, and it's not an attempt to assuage my guilt. It would involve overseeing facility management, security coordination, and vendor relationships for all our locations. The salary is 400,000 naira monthly, with full benefits including health care for you and Amara, education allowance, retirement contributions, and reasonable hours that wouldn't require you to work multiple jobs to survive. If you're interested, and if the interview goes well, I would offer you this position based on your merits. But I want you to know that if this makes you uncomfortable, if you'd rather not work for someone who treated you the way I treated you, I will understand completely, and I'll make sure your application is given fair consideration. For other positions in the company, where you would report directly to me." She took a breath, trying to read his reaction and finding his expression still neutral. "And regardless of whether you want this job, I want to tell you about the changes that have happened here since we last spoke, because you deserve to know that what you said to me mattered, that it wasn't just words that I forgot as soon as the crisis passed." Victoria spent the next 20 minutes describing the initiatives she implemented, the living wage program that had raised base pay for over 200 employees, the scholarship fund that was currently supporting 15 employees' children through university, the cultural shifts she'd been trying to foster where people were treated with dignity regardless of their position. She pulled up financial reports showing that these changes had initially impacted profit margins, exactly as the board had predicted, but that employee retention had improved, productivity had increased, and the company's reputation had attracted better partnerships and talent because people wanted to work for an organization that valued them. She was honest about her ongoing struggles, about how changing corporate culture was slower and harder than changing policies, about how she still caught herself falling into old patterns and had to consciously correct course, about how becoming a better person was turning out to be the hardest work she'd ever undertaken because it required constant attention in ways that business strategy never had. Marcus listened intently, asking occasional clarifying questions that suggested he was actually considering the position rather than just being polite, and Victoria felt hope rising in her chest that maybe this could work, that maybe she could offer genuine opportunity rather than just perform reformation. When she finished, Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful, and Victoria waited with uncharacteristic patience, because she was learning that some things couldn't be rushed, that people deserve time to process and decide without pressure. "That's impressive," Marcus finally said, his tone sincere. "Genuinely impressive. A lot of people make promises after crisis moments and then conveniently forget them when life goes back to normal. The fact that you've actually followed through, that you've sustained these changes for 6 months, even when it cost you something, that suggests you meant what you said in the hospital." Victoria felt relief at his acknowledgement, felt validated that her efforts were visible and meaningful. But Marcus wasn't finished. "But I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to be honest in your answer. Are you offering me this job because I'm qualified, or because having me work here would let you feel like you've fully repaid the debt from Zainab's life being saved? Because if it's the second thing, I can't accept it. I don't want to be your redemption project or your proof that you changed. I need to know that if I take this position, it's because you actually believe I can do the work and bring value to your company, not because you're trying to make yourself feel better about our past." The question was fair and direct, cutting through any possible pretense to the heart of what this offer actually meant, and Victoria appreciated his willingness to challenge her even in this context, where most people would have just accepted whatever was offered. She thought carefully about her answer, knowing that this moment required absolute honesty because anything less would undermine everything she'd been trying to build. "Both," she finally said, meeting his eyes. "I can't pretend that our history doesn't factor into this, that knowing you saved my daughter's life doesn't make me want to help you in return. But I also genuinely believe you're qualified for this position. Your practical experience, your problem-solving skills, your ability to understand facilities from multiple angles, including security and maintenance, your reputation for integrity and teamwork, all of that makes you someone who would bring real value to this role. So yes, part of my motivation is personal, but that doesn't mean the professional assessment isn't legitimate. If you were unqualified, I wouldn't offer you this position no matter how grateful I am. But you're not unqualified. You're actually exactly what we need. And the fact that hiring you also allows me to offer opportunity to someone who deserves it is something I'm not going to apologize for." Marcus seemed to accept this answer, nodding slowly as he processed her words, and then he asked several specific questions about the job responsibilities, reporting structures, growth opportunities, and company culture that demonstrated he was seriously considering the position rather than just going through motions. Victoria answered each question honestly, including information about challenges he'd likely face and areas where her company's culture was still evolving toward the values she wanted to embody, not trying to oversell the opportunity, but giving him the thing-fed information he'd need to make an informed decision. They talked for nearly an hour, the conversation gradually shifting from tense navigation of their complicated history to genuine discussion between an employer with an opening and a candidate assessing whether the role fit his skills and goals. Victoria found herself impressed again by Marcus's intelligence and thoughtfulness, by the way he asked questions that revealed both practical wisdom and ethical considerations, by his careful evaluation of whether this opportunity would be right not just financially, but personally, whether working for Victoria would compromise his values or whether her demonstrated changes made it a workplace where his integrity could remain intact. At the end of the interview, Marcus asked for time to think about it, explaining that he needed to consider how this change would affect the morrow and whether the benefits outweighed the complications of working for someone they had complicated history with, and Victoria immediately agreed without trying to pressure him toward an answer. "Take whatever time you need. This is a major decision that affects not just you, but your daughter, and you should feel completely comfortable with whatever choice you make. If you decide you'd prefer to work elsewhere, I'll write you a recommendation that honestly represents your qualifications without mentioning our personal history, if you'd rather keep that private." She paused, then added something that she hoped communicated her sincerity. "And regardless of your decision about the job, I want to say thank you again for what you did for Zainab, and for what you said to me in the hospital that day. You didn't owe me kindness or wisdom, but you gave both freely, and it changed my life in ways that are still unfolding. Whether or not you work here, whether or not our paths cross again, please know that you made a difference." Marcus met her eyes, seemed to find something there that satisfied whatever he'd been looking for, and nodded once before standing to leave, his borrowed suit still carefully worn, his dignity still intact, despite the power imbalances that made these interactions unequal, no matter how much Victoria tried to level them. 3 days later, Marcus called to accept the position, explaining that he'd talked it over with Amara and Mrs. Okonkwo and had decided that the opportunity was too significant to pass up, that his daughter deserved the security and benefits this job provided, but also that he appreciated the changes Victoria was making and wanted to be part of a company that was actively trying to value people properly. His first day was both ordinary and extraordinary ordinary in the sense that he arrived, went through HR onboarding, met his team, and began learning his responsibilities like any new employee, but extraordinary in the weight of symbolism that his presence carried for Victoria and for the handful of people who knew their story. Victoria had worried that having him work directly under her supervision might be awkward, but Marcus approached the job with professionalism that separated their working relationship from their personal history, engaging with projects and problems with the practical intelligence that had made her want to hire him in the first place. Over the following weeks and months, he proved himself valuable in exactly the ways Victoria had anticipated, identifying inefficiencies in their security contracts, improving relationships with vendors by treating them with the respect she was learning they deserved, and mentoring other employees with the same grace he demonstrated in their hardest moments. The relationship between Victoria and Marcus evolved slowly into something that resembled friendship, though it was always tempered by the reality of their positions and their history, an acknowledgement that some things can be forgiven, but not forgotten, that transformation is possible, but the past remains part of the story. They had lunch occasionally, conversations that ranged from work topics to their children to the ongoing challenge of being better people than circumstances had taught them to be. And Victoria found herself grateful for his willingness to be honest with her, to call her out when she slipped back into old patterns, to offer the kind of accountability that people in her position rarely received. Through Marcus, Victoria met Amara properly for the first time since the terrible encounter in her lobby, a meeting arranged carefully after months of Victoria demonstrating through sustained action that her changes were genuine rather than performative. The apology Victoria offered to Amara was sincere and age-appropriate, explaining that she'd been wrong to speak unkindly, that adults sometimes make mistakes just like children do, that she hoped Amara could forgive her even though she understood if it took time, and Amara had accepted with the resilient adaptability that children often possess, more interested in whether Victoria's daughter wanted to be friends than in holding grudges about adult failures. Victoria and Zainab's relationship continued healing through consistent presence and gradually rebuilt trust. Victoria learning to be a mother who prioritized connection over achievement, who showed up for school plays and parent conferences not as duty but as genuine interest, who listened to her daughter's thoughts and feelings without immediately jumping to solutions or dismissing concerns as trivial. Zainab slowly became comfortable being vulnerable again with her mother, sharing hopes and fears and the complicated emotions of adolescence. And Victoria treasured these conversations more than any business deal she'd ever closed because they represented recovery of something she'd almost lost forever. The two families began spending time together, occasionally dinners where Zainab and Amara bonded over shared interests, weekend outings to parks or museums where economic differences faded in the simple pleasure of community and connection. Moments that felt like grace made visible, like proof that transformation was possible, even after significant harm had been done. The city continued its rhythms, wealth and poverty still existing side by side, systemic inequalities still creating the circumstances that made people like Marcus struggle while people like Victoria accumulated. But within the small sphere of influence that Victoria could actually affect, things were measurably better. People were treated with more dignity, and one woman's crisis had sparked changes that rippled outward to touch hundreds of lives. Victoria knew she'd never fully balance the scales, never completely atone for the years of casual cruelty and systemic exploitation, never become the perfect embodiment of the values she was learning to hold. But she also knew that progress didn't require perfection, that becoming better was a lifelong process rather than a destination. That character was built through consistent choices in ordinary moments rather than through grand gestures or public declarations. She'd learned that the people society dismissed as insignificant often possessed the greatest wisdom, that poverty didn't diminish worth and wealth didn't create it, that true security came from relationships and integrity rather than bank accounts and status, that the most valuable thing you could give or receive was someone seeing your full humanity and responding with grace. On the first anniversary of Zainab's medical crisis and Marcus's blood donation, Victoria organized a small private gathering at her home, just her family and Marcus's family. No publicity or fanfare, just the people whose lives had been changed by that moment when crisis stripped away pretense and revealed what actually mattered. They shared a meal that Victoria had cooked herself with Zainab's help, laughing over slightly burned vegetables and oversalted rice because perfection wasn't the point. Connection was the point. Showing up honestly was the point. They told stories about the past year, about changes and challenges and moments of grace, about learning and unlearning and the ongoing work of becoming better humans. Amara and Zainab had become genuine friends despite their age difference, the older girl taking on a protective, mentoring role that Amara absorbed eagerly, both of them benefiting from a relationship that crossed the economic divides their city usually enforced. Marcus and Victoria looked at each other across the table at one point, a moment of shared understanding passing between them about how far they'd traveled from that terrible morning in her building as lobby, how pain and crisis and grace had rearranged both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. As the evening wound down and Marcus prepared to take Amara home, he paused at Victoria's door, turning back to say something that felt like both acknowledgement and benediction. "You did the work. Not just the easy performative stuff, but the actual hard work of changing who you are. I'm proud of you, and I think Kiyomo would be proud too, because she believed people could always become better if they chose to. Thank you for choosing to." Victoria felt tears in her eyes again. The same tears that had come in the hospital 6 months ago were carrying different meaning now, carrying gratitude for second chances and grace undeserved, and the possibility of redemption that required action, but that was available to anyone willing to do the work. She hugged Marcus and Amara goodbye, watched them walk to their car that was nicer now because financial stability allowed for some improvements, closed her door, and returned to where Zainab was cleaning up dishes, her daughter humming contentedly in a way she hadn't in years. Victoria joined her at the sink, taking up a towel to dry what Zainab washed, working in comfortable silence, and thought about how sometimes the universe breaks you open so that better things can grow in the cracks. How crisis can be the catalyst for transformation if you're willing to see it. How the people you think are beneath you might be the ones standing on higher ground. How blood literally connected them all regardless of economic status or social position. How grace freely given could change everything if you let it. How character was built in moments when nobody was keeping score, and the only reward was knowing you'd chosen kindness over cruelty, humanity over transaction, love over fear. The night deepened around them. The city continued its restless movement, and Victoria felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace that came not from control or achievement, but from alignment between who she was and who she wanted to be, from relationships built on honesty rather than transaction, from the knowledge that tomorrow she would wake up and continue the work of being better, that transformation was ongoing rather than complete, that she'd been given a gift she didn't deserve, and had chosen to honor it through sustained action rather than just grateful words. That was enough. That was everything. That was grace.